hello, good morning. Thank you for that lovely welcome. And it's lovely to be back here. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that... It's a bit unusual. It's much more high-tech than I was expecting. I thought I'd have a microphone and something to lean on, but no, I'm just here, just going for it. So my talk is called The Victorian Ghost Hunters. It is based on, if this works, the research from my new book, which is called Ghosts of Wales, Accounts from the Victorian Archives. And I chose to talk about the Victorian ghost hunters specifically today, because the research it's divided into 9 sections, but I thought, well, I'm talking to an ASAP crowd today. I'm talking to a room of modern-day ghost hunters. So what better topic to talk about than the Victorian ghost hunters? Maybe you can see some similarities, some parallels with what was going on at the time. Hopefully you might get some inspiration from some of the quotes I have coming up as well from some of the people who are looking. From a more selfish point of view, I chose it as well. It's my favorite part of the book. It's the part I enjoyed looking at the most. And it tickled me. It made me laugh in a way that in the Victorian era, there were some people described as ghost hunters because they hunted ghosts. And I don't mean in the modern sense that they investigated ghosts or they looked for ghosts to seek for ghosts, but they actually hunted them down. And the best example of people who hunted ghosts would be the good old angry mob. If there was a supposedly haunted house in the Victorian era, it wasn't unusual to find a crowd gathering outside. It might be a small crowd, 5 or 6 kids just throwing stones at the windows, or a much larger crowd, 500 or 600 people, blocking off the road, all waiting to hunt down a ghost. And if they saw that ghost, it could end quite badly for that poor ghost unless the police got there in time. The police were often on hand to try and keep control to stop any antisocial behavior. If the police didn't get there in time, it could end quite badly for that poor ghost because 9 times out of 10, not even that, 9.999 times out of 10, it wasn't actually a ghost. It was a case of mistaken identity, a case of somebody being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes it was somebody pretending to be a ghost. A lot of times it was somebody pretending to be a ghost impersonator. And you could argue that if somebody is hanging around outside a supposedly haunted house, pretending to be a ghost with a white sheet over their head, and the angry mob spots them, hunts them down, chases them through the streets and around the dark alleyways and throws things at them and pounces, maybe they deserve what the Victorian press would call a sound thrashing for their efforts. Now, that wasn't always the case. Some of these accounts are a little bit more vindictive. 1 or 2 of them read like Victorian witch hunts. If you wanted to get revenge on somebody for any reason, maybe Mrs. Jones from down the road is getting a little bit too friendly with your husband, what better way to get revenge on Mrs. Jones than to tell this angry mob baying for ghostly blood, Mrs. Jones is the ghost, problem solved. And the worst example I've found of innocent people being caught in this way relates to 2 tramps in the town of Blaenavon in South Wales. Now, the tramps were trying to find shelter from the rain. The weather in Wales has not improved much from the 19th century to now. It was torrential, it was tipping it down, just like when I left home this morning. And these tramps were trying to find any dry spot to get away from the rain. Now, unfortunately for those tramps, the dry spot they chose happened to be on the same stretch of road as a supposedly haunted house. An angry mob was gathering. They saw the tramps, these shadowy forms cowering where they shouldn't have been cowering. They put 2 and 2 together. They did not end up with tramps, they ended up with ghosts. They hunted them down. They hunted them down with pokers and metal bars. This did not end well for the tramps, although there is a silver lining. The police were not on the scene in this particular occasion, but the tramps managed to get away. They found a friendly PC who very kindly arranged for them to spend the night in a local inn. So yes, they had a bit of a beat-in. On the plus side, they had a nice room to spend the night in afterwards. But I don't want to get too gory first thing on a Saturday morning. So on a more comical side, when I was pitching the idea of this book to my publisher, I mentioned that some of these accounts sound like the plot from a Scooby-Doo cartoon. Like a plot from a Scooby-Doo cartoon. I did not mean that there were gangs of pesky kids driving around in a 60s-style camper van pulling masks off bad guys, but rather some of the people impersonating ghosts, ooh, I've done something weird there. We'll have to ignore the full screen thing for now then. But some of the people impersonating ghosts, the villains, if I can call them that, the criminals who were dressing as ghosts to burgle properties, to attack people, to rob people, or just to scare people, they weren't always the sharpest tools in the box, and they were often caught out in some quite comical ways. Now, the next account I'd like to look at took place in North Wales, right on the English border, not far from Chester, in a small place called Rosset. Rosset was being terrorized by a ghost. The problem they had in Rosset was that there was no outdoor lighting, there was no artificial lighting, so the ghost could pop up, scare somebody, and like that, they were gone into the darkness. Now, the locals were getting wise to this, and they were starting to gather at night in crowds into angry mobs to find this ghost. On one particular night, the ghost decided to pop up and scare a man on a bicycle. Popped up, boo. Well, you might not have said boo, I just made that up, but he certainly popped up. The man fell off his bicycle. But the man was ready for the ghost, so the man pulled out his gun and shot a bullet at the ghost. People did this, some people in the Victorian era, which leads us to believe maybe they weren't entirely convinced these ghosts were ethereal in nature. But he shot the ghost with a bullet. Luckily for the ghost, the bullet missed. The ghost did its usual trick, disappeared into the darkness. But the crowd were rowdy, and one of them had their dog with them. The dog chased into the darkness after the ghost. And the first real inclination they had that this ghost was not paranormal in nature is when the dog bit the ghost's leg. The ghost let out an ow noise and fell to the ground. The ghost ripped the white sheet off the ghost. Underneath was the villain, if I can call him a villain. In this case, the authorities were on hand to apprehend him. He was not beaten to a pulp like the unfortunate tramps. And the reason I've chosen to pick this one out in particular is because, as I mentioned, the Scooby-Doo line, I punched the air when I found this one, because I'd actually found my very own real-life ghost-hunting Scooby-Doo dog who was alive and well in Wales in the Victorian era. In fact, I want to use the pointer in this talk at some point, so I'm going to use it now. I actually asked my designer to work a little dog into the book. And that there is my Scooby-Doo. It doesn't look much like Scooby-Doo. I didn't want the Warner Brothers legal team getting in touch. But use your imagination. That there is the Scooby-Doo. Now, sometimes when these mobs went hunting, they were joined by journalists, which is where all of my information comes from. It's from the press at the time. When the journalists tagged along, they could write about what was happening. And there's one account I've singled out from all of these just to read some lines from. The reason I've chosen this one is because so far I've spoken of what was very much the flesh and blood ghost, the human ghosts at the time, what people would call the prowling ghosts, those influenced by the like of Spring Hill Jack and so on. That wasn't always the case, and what interests me more are the ones which are potentially paranormal in nature, the ones which weren't explained away as being humans. Now, in this particular case, the journalist went along to investigate a haunted house. And what was happening in the haunted house, supposedly haunted house, which took place in Cardiff, in the Riverside area, was put down to river rats at the time. People assumed it was river rats. But the evidence mounted, people were starting to think, no, there's something a bit stranger going on here. Well, the journalist went along, and he wrote that the ghost, in the course of his antics, had broken the windows, and the crowd outside kept me company and chatted through the broken panes. So the angry mob, or the crowd certainly, were there again, talking to the journalist who was alone in the house overnight looking for ghosts or whatever might be happening there. And the journalist wrote that, I sat there for about 2 hours, and at midnight, when only a straggler or two remained in the street, and I was feeling a bit funky and a trifle tired, when bang, bang, bang went something in the small kitchen adjoining, like somebody rapping the table heavily. With the bravery of a forlorn hope volunteer, I rushed into the room in time to see, in the moonlight, a plate falling from a small rough table to the floor, where, in the same moment, it lay smashed to atoms. Now, that is just a small part of the evidence which was going on in this house collected by the journalist. There were other witnesses. And like I said, the reason I've chosen that one is because that was not solved at the time. That was left open-ended and could potentially, this property in Cardiff could still be haunted, if it is haunted, to this very day. So what I'd like to do with this talk, apologies again, this is gone a bit small, is to look at two questions in particular. How do ghost sightings from the Victorian era differ from the modern day, and who investigated them? They're two very large questions for me to squash into a half-hour talk. But as to who investigated them, well, I started with the over-the-top example of these crowds, these angry mobs who would go out hunting, also the journalists who wrote about what was happening for the printed press. As to how the ghost sightings differed, again, a lot of the sightings could be put down to flesh and blood ghosts, to human beings impersonating ghosts. But that wasn't always the case, and as I said, they are the cases, the ones which weren't humans, which interest me more. Now, to answer those questions, I'm going to pose another two questions, which are much quicker, and will explain why I wasted all this time doing this, why I spent all this time doing this research. It wasn't a waste. That's a terrible slip. Why I wasted my life doing this research, and how I reached my conclusions. And those questions are, why Wales and why the Victorian era? Well, as you might have gathered, I am indeed a Welshman. But it wasn't a case of, I'm Welsh, so I'm going to write about Wales. There's an old saying, which is when you write a book, you should write the book that you want to read. And that was very much the case when I came to this book. It's common sense, it's practical advice. I wanted to buy a book about Welsh ghosts in the Victorian era, and I could not find one. So I thought, well, I'll do it myself. To do that, I rolled up my sleeves and I went into the newspaper archives. I went through all the newspapers I could find from 1837 to 1901, not just in the English language, I also went through the Welsh language newspapers. And what is quite interesting about those, sadly, I have no way of proving this, but there were accounts and reports in the Welsh language papers which did not appear in the English language papers, which means possibly I might actually be the first person to translate these stories into the English language. Sadly, I have no way of proving that, but if it's true, that's quite a cool accident which came about as a result of my research. And it's also worth pointing out that I wanted to ghost accounts from the Victorian era, which is why I went to the source material, not accounts which have been attached afterwards to Victorian properties or to Victorian personalities. So, for example, I would say arguably the most famous haunted place in Wales right now is a place called Craig-y-Nors Castle in the Swansea Valley. It's very well known in Wales, in the United Kingdom, around the world, because a lot of the sort of American shaky camera ghost hunting type TV shows have been there to film, and they've spread the word around the world. And it's said to be haunted by the ghost of Adelina Patti. Adelina Patti was a world-famous opera singer, soprano, who sang to kings and queens and heads of states, politicians, Abraham Lincoln famously. But in the Victorian era, Adelina Patti was alive and well and happy and singing and partying in Craig-y-Nors Castle. She was not haunting the place. So it was only those accounts from the period that I was looking for, not the ones which have been attached afterwards. Why the Victorian era? Well, I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, I did not coin this phrase, I stole this phrase, but the Victorian era was the golden age of ghosts. Why was it the golden age of ghosts? Well, there's one good example up there, what was going on in the seance room and with spiritualism. There's probably 101 good reasons, but the one I'd like to focus on, because it impacts directly on my research, was what was going on in the newspapers. Because I would say, as well as being the golden age of ghosts, it was also the golden age of the printed press. When it came to the media, there was no competition. Newspaper was king. There was no television, internet, CFAX, nothing. It was the newspaper or gossip in the local pub. And what was in the paper? There was a lot of ghosts. First of all, they came from the journalists. And this is a huge contradiction, but the journalists wrote a lot about ghosts. But when you read their accounts, I'm generalizing slightly here for the sake of this talk, but they fall into two categories. They either laugh at the idea of ghosts, they're all very skeptical, they're very cynical, and the reports are either very tongue-in-cheek, where a ghost has been seen, but ha ha ha, it didn't really happen, it's silly. Or the other category is more snide, where they look down their noses at people, where anyone who believes this is a superstitious idiot, which a lot of the papers were very quick to do, certainly with the Welsh accounts. People in Wales are backward, stupid, superstitious people. But once you get through this tone, nevertheless, these accounts were front-page news, headline news, and sold the papers. So while they clearly didn't believe a word of what they were writing, they wrote it again and again and again and again to fill the papers. That was one way of filling the papers, but a journalist is the most expensive way of filling a paper, to pay a journalist, which I find hard to believe when I look at my pay packet every month, but it is the most expensive way of filling a paper. A much cheaper way is to let the public do it for nothing. And what really was like gold for me in my research is if the member of the public sees a ghost and they want to write about that experience and send it in, as long as the editor publishes it, that's where I can come along 150 years or so later and trawl through these first-hand accounts which were published in the papers alongside the first-hand accounts by the journalists. And a third way of filling the paper, which sadly I really haven't got the time to go into in too much depth in this talk, is works of fiction. Papers at the time published works of fiction on a daily basis or weekly or monthly, depending on their frequency. They could be short stories or longer stories, serialized. And if we look at the fiction of the time, I mean, arguably the most famous example probably would be Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And it's no coincidence that I find accounts after that is published of ghosts who bear striking similarity to Jacob Marley, but also his contemporaries, which were printed in the Welsh papers at the time, the likes of Wilkie Collins, Mary Elizabeth Gaskell, put that back, all of which was going on in the newspapers. But who hunted them? Well, again, I started with the over-the-top example of the crowds. I imagine most people would expect one society to be right at the top of my list in a talk about Victorian ghost hunters, and there's probably members of that society in here today, and that would be the Society of Psychical Research, the SPR. Well, believe it or not, from my research, the SPR was severely lacking. There was one line which these cynical journalists like to wheel out again and again, and when they mentioned the SPR, the line they used a lot was, "We fear the SPR do not have a ghost of a chance of catching their ghost." And they used this like it was the funniest thing ever invented. And it got quite tiresome. That's not to say the SPR didn't investigate in Wales, they did. But again, the accounts were lacking and were worthless to me. So they would say, a ghost has been seen, the SPR are going to investigate, but then there's no follow-up, so you have no idea what actually happened, or the other way around. The ghost has been laid, the SPR were there, but you have no idea what the SPR did when they were there. If people in Wales wanted the help of the SPR, they could send letters to them, some of which were published. There were letters which were sent to Professor Henry Sidgwick, who was the president at the time, well, the first president, the only president, asking for advice. These were published in the press, and the replies which were sent back, not from him himself, but from members of the SPR, offering practical advice on how they could investigate, were also published, some of which people used, which did help them in their investigations, and which in one account did disprove a ghost, thanks to the SPR's advice. And there's one fascinating letter which was sent to the editor of the Western Mail, the national newspaper for Wales, from two founding members, Edmund Gurney and Frederick W.H. Myers, who, I need to stop tapping, who were looking for accounts from Wales which they could archive and possibly investigate themselves. It's a fascinating letter, but it also strikes me as being very generic in tone. I imagine they sent exactly the same letter to, say, Scotland, and just changed the word Wales to Scotland, or to Yorkshire and changed the word Wales to Yorkshire. But nevertheless, there was a call for accounts to be sent into them. But when it comes to high-profile Welsh people who are investigated, because that's what all my research is based on, if I had to single out the most high-profile person to put their neck on the line, and people did have to put their neck on the line at the time, because being tarred with the brush of being some kind of ghost weirdo was not good for your reputation, which could not be good for your career, which could not be good for your livelihood. So in this time of rationality, to put your neck on the line, if I had to pick the most high profile, that would be Alfred Russel Wallace, who, for those of you unfamiliar with Wallace, Wallace was a Welsh biologist who, independently of Charles Darwin, conceived of the theory of evolution, and is also the only person recognized by Darwin for doing so. Well, Wallace, how can I say this? While Darwin is very much seen as a genius in the scientific world, as a godlike figure almost, Wallace's reputation wasn't quite as high. And one area where they did differ quite a bit is that Wallace was much more open to the kind of ideas that we're discussing this weekend. Early in his career, he investigated mesmerism. He was ridiculed at the time for doing so. There were members of the scientific community who laughed at him for bothering to investigate mesmerism, but he stuck to his guns. He thought it was worthwhile, and he continued to do so. And later on, he did the same with spiritualism, and he was again mocked. But there are a few words which Wallace wrote in 1893, which I'd like to read to you, which I think might strike a chord with some people today. And Wallace wrote that, "Nothing has been more constantly disbelieved and ridiculed than the alleged appearance of phantasms of the living or of the recently dead, whether seen by one person alone or by several together. Imagination, disease, imposture, or erroneous observation have been again and again put forth as sufficient explanation of these appearances, but when carefully examined, they do not prove to be impostures, but stand out with greater distinctness as veridical and sometimes objective phenomena." Now, what Wallace was saying there in a much fancier way than I would have put it is that people are very quick to dismiss these things as it's just, let's pick one, it's just imposture. But if they bothered sitting down for 2 minutes to look at the evidence, they would find quite quickly that it was not imposture and would actually maybe push them toward Wallace's way of thinking. Now, Wallace did have a bit of leeway because I said he was considered an eminent scientist. Other public figures weren't given quite the same leeway, although those who did get away with it a bit more were those involved with the church, because by its very nature, if you are of the Christian faith, then you must have some supernatural beliefs. So the priests, the vicars, these high-standing members of society could go along with it, because if you believe in miracles and the resurrection and the Holy Ghost, it isn't that much of a leap to say if this happened in biblical times, it could in theory happen in Victorian Britain. What I'd like to do to finish with, though, is to single out one politician who did put his neck on the line, who was brave enough to come out with his beliefs, and that man is called Henry White. Henry White was a councillor in Cardiff. At the time of this, he was a councillor for the Cathays district. He was also a landlord. Like most politicians, he made a lot of money renting out property to people. And it was brought to his attention by a prospective tenant that there were two supposedly haunted houses in Cardiff, which he went along to investigate. He was left believing, right back at the start, he was left believing not so much that they were haunted, but there was something there which he could not explain, and he thought they warranted further investigation. This made its way into the press. The news got out that Henry White, the politician from Cardiff, was one of these strange ghost people. The normal thing to do in this situation is to take a step back and let it all die down. What I love about Henry White is he went the opposite way. He dived in both feet first. He called the press to his office, not the press from Wales, the national press. He called the Evening Express in. He sat them down. He went into even more detail about why he thought these places might be haunted. And then he outlined a scientific way that people could investigate for themselves, because he wanted to put an end to these scenes of angry mobs gathering outside supposedly haunted houses, hunting down innocent people and beating them with metal bars and pokers. And to do that, he suggested that to begin with, you should start with evidence gathering. The witnesses should be trustworthy and the evidence above reproach. If that is the case, then you begin your investigation. And to finish with, I'd like to just read out Henry White's guide to investigating. He said, as a preliminary step, each of a party of friends associated with a common object should take one of these books. He suggests a book called The Medium and other volumes giving information about the matter, and thoroughly digest its contents and make notes upon it. So before you rush out beating people up, first of all, research your subject and work out what it is that you're looking for. Then, a conference should be held. What, we're already doing that. Notes compared. And finally, it should be determined to pursue a course of systematic investigation, the whole thing to be followed up, if possible, to some real conclusion. The movement, of course, should be set on foot with a mutual compact or declaration that the whole of the investigations be thoroughly honest, conscientious, and honourable. And I think if we continue to investigate in 2017 and into the future in a way which is thoroughly honest and conscientious and honourable, we will be on the right track. Thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much.